This judge was arrested for ruining a championship. To this day, he is hated by the fans. It all happened in 2005, the year Brazilian football came to a halt when it was discovered that the entire championship had been rigged. Up until then, International was leading the country's main championship, but the fans themselves knew something was wrong. The truth only came out when a journalist named André Rizek splashed the news on the cover of the country's top football magazine, The Whistle Mafia. After a long investigation, this journalist discovered that two referees, Edilson Pereira de Carvalho and Paulo José Danilon, were involved in this corruption. They were being paid by a businessman to rig match results in order to profit from sports betting. Obviously, the police issued a search warrant and immediately arrested the two referees and the businessman. But the more the investigations went on, the more dirty secrets they uncovered about that championship. In total, this businessman was making about $100,000 from each game, and more than 10 games were rigged. To do the dirty work, the referees were getting only 10% of that amount, which is very little compared to the damage they caused to the championship. But the worst part is that the rigged games were very important ones. In other words, an entire football season was thrown in the trash. They didn't even try to hide it. Some of the calls were so bizarre that it's almost funny. Take a look at this obvious penalty where the referee didn't call anything. But the worst was this play, which was also a clear penalty. But instead of calling it, the ref sent off a player for complaining. Obviously, all of this was part of the match-fixing scheme. But how did they resolve this situation? After all, the championship couldn't just continue as if nothing happened. The Brazilian Football Confederation decided not to cancel the championship, but drastic measures were taken. All the matches officiated by the involved referees that year were annulled, and the teams played those games again, this time fairly.
Desfile liminar, anulando as 11 partidas arbitradas pelo senhor Edilson Pereira de Carvalho na Série A do Campeonato Brasileiro de 2005. E determino sejam elas realizadas novamente.
As a result, International, who had been the champion, lost their lead, and Corinthians ended up winning the title that season. Unfortunately, these measures were only applied to the main championship. These referees had interfered in lower division games and even in the Libertadores, and those weren't annulled. But the biggest injustice of all is what happened to the main person responsible for this corruption. Although both referees were involved in the betting scheme, Edilson Pereira was confirmed as the main culprit. Of course, he was judged for what he did and was even detained by the police. But there was a mistake in the whole process that led to one of the biggest injustices in football. At that time, there was no specific punishment for match fixing in Brazil. In other words, Edilson couldn't be imprisoned because legally he hadn't committed a crime. In the end, nothing happened to him. Even though he damaged the entire country's football, this referee didn't even go to jail. But fate found a way to solve this problem. The way this ex-referee lives today will shock you. After the scandal, he was obviously banned from football and tried to restart his life with regular jobs, which didn't go well. It's said he worked as a store clerk, salesman, cook, and so on, but the fact is he never managed to keep a job. Why? Well, fans always recognized his face, and in the end, he would get fired. Today, he is unemployed and lives off his mother's pension. One way or another, justice was served. The other referee involved in the scandal even tried to officiate in other sports, but was completely rejected by fans, and now also lives in poverty. The only one who came out relatively okay was the businessman, if we can put it that way. Sure, he lost the money from the illegal bets, but he continued with his businesses that still made him a good amount of money, and he didn't go to jail either. But if you thought this story was bizarre, you haven't heard about the biggest corruption scandal in Colombian football. Many years ago, Colombians ruled world football, but they only managed that by spilling a lot of innocent blood. This whole story begins with one of the most infamous mobsters in history and his immense love for football. Escobar made his mark on the world with the power he gained through his illegal empire, but what few people know is that a large part of that money went into football. Much of the investment went to Atlético Nacional and Independiente de Medellín, which was his favorite team. But sometimes, investing in player acquisitions and stadium construction wasn't enough to win titles. In fact, at that time, Brazilian teams were very strong, and even with heavy investment, it was quite difficult for the Colombians to win continental titles. That's when Escobar started to invest, let's say, in the referees of that era. The first controversy happened in 1989 when Juan Baca was incentivized to favor one side. According to the referee himself, the officiating crew was gathered in a hotel before the game when a group of men broke into their room holding a briefcase. But instead of offering a small bribe or a mysterious gift, the men gave the referees only one option: take the money in the briefcase and make sure Escobar's team won the next match, which was a Libertadores semi-final. When they asked if there was another option, the men revealed they were armed. The result? At the end of the semi-final, Atlético Nacional won the game 6-0. In fact, it was only years later that Juan admitted to rigging the game. When asked why he didn't report Escobar at the time, he replied, "I had 2 kids to raise. What could I do?" After Juan's account went public, other referees started speaking up. And that's when the worst of Escobar's crimes in sports came to light. And this wasn't the only crime committed that year. Sometime after that semi-final, in November 1989 to be exact, another terrible crime took place. Assistant referee Alvaro Ortega was found dead in Medellin, and at first it was believed he was the victim of a robbery, but that wasn't what happened. Weeks before this tragedy, Ortega had made a grave arrangement. What do you mean? Well, he correctly disallowed a goal by Independiente de Medellin in a crucial match against América de Cali. Obviously, Escobar was furious about this and decided to fix things for his team with his own hands. The Colombian Federation was pressured by FIFA and CONMEBOL and ultimately decided to suspend that year's Colombian Championship, which ended without a champion. But this wasn't enough to stop Escobar. The following year, he did even worse things. In 1990, Uruguayan referee Daniel Cardellino reported to CONMEBOL that he had been coerced before a match. He said he received threats and a bribe attempt of $20,000. The idea was for him to favor the Colombian team in the Libertadores quarterfinals. But the story gets even worse. Faced with convenient threats, the referee gave in, and the match was won by the Colombians 2-0. But what no one knew was that on that night, the referees weren't the only ones threatened. In 2014, many years after this game, Eurico Miranda, who was the president of Vasco, the Colombian team's opponent that day, revealed that there were men with machine guns in his team's locker room. And this time, evil prevailed, as the championship was not cancelled, and Escobar's team ended up becoming the champion. And of course, there was a lot of money involved with betting in Colombia, and to this day, it's unknown how many referees were involved in this corruption scheme. Believe it or not, this kind of thing happens everywhere. In Italy, 5 referees were caught in a huge betting scandal. Massimo De Santis was one of the most respected referees in Italy when he was arrested and banned from football. In fact, 5 referees were involved in this scheme. According to investigations, Italian club officials received an unusual offer from the Italian Referees Committee. They could buy match results directly from the Italian Referees Committee. Once the purchase was made, the right referees, who were already involved in the scheme and obviously received money for it, were assigned to the right games. But when the whole case came to light, the entire scheme collapsed, bringing down several clubs with it. The championship wasn't cancelled, but all the involved clubs were penalized with fines and point deductions. In this mess, giants like Juventus were relegated when it was proven that the club president was involved in the scheme. But just like in Brazil, not all the involved parties were imprisoned due to loopholes in the law. Actually, the only one of the referees who was arrested was indeed Massimo De Santis, one of the best in the world at the time. This guy had already officiated in World Cups, Olympics and Champions League matches, but there was no way out. When they discovered his involvement, he was permanently banned from football and sentenced to 2 years in prison.